7 categories. That is what George Willis told his son on the night of September 14, 1971, the evening before his last day at the Smithsonian Institution. Not 7 objects, not 7 rooms, 7 categories of physical material that had occupied shelf space in the sub-level storage of the Museum of Natural History for the entirety of his 34-year career, that had never appeared in any published catalog, that had never been accessioned in the institution's public-facing inventory system, and that he had spent 34 years moving, documenting internally, and keeping out of the sightlines of the researchers who came to the building on official visits. 7 categories. He named them one by one. His son, a 31-year-old electrical engineer named David Willis, wrote them down on the back of an envelope he found in the kitchen drawer. The envelope is in a shoebox in David Willis's house in Silver Spring, Maryland. George Willis was 62 years old on the night he told his son. He had spent his entire adult working life in the sub-level storage of one of the most visited public institutions in the United States, in rooms that the public did not visit, and that most of the institution's own curatorial staff had never entered. He was not a curator.
He was a collections manager, the man responsible for the physical handling, location tracking, and environmental maintenance of objects that were in institutional possession but not on display and not in the active research queue. His job was to know where things were. After 34 years, he knew where everything was, including the things that were not supposed to be anywhere. He had taken the job in 1937 at the age of 28 after 2 years of work as a warehouse manager for a government supply depot in Virginia. The Smithsonian had advertised for a man who understood inventory management, physical handling of fragile materials, and the maintenance of environmental records. George Willis understood all 3. He had no academic credentials in any scientific field, which suited the position. A collections manager who did not understand what the objects were would not be tempted to ask questions about them. He started in September 1937. He retired on September 15, 1971. He worked in the sub-level storage every working day of those 34 years, and the night before he left, he told his son what he had found there. But here is what the Smithsonian Institution has spent 150 years making sure you never ask about. The Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., houses approximately 145 million physical specimens and objects across its various collection storage facilities. The public exhibition spaces contain a fraction of 1% of the total holdings. The remainder, the overwhelming majority of what the institution possesses, is in storage. In environmental controlled rooms on multiple levels of the building, in off-site facilities in Suitland, Maryland, and in the sub-level storage that runs beneath the museum's main floor in a configuration that does not appear on the institution's publicly distributed floor plans. The sub-level storage was the primary responsibility of the collections management staff, of which George Willis was a member for 34 years. It housed, at the time of his retirement in 1971, material that had been accumulating since the institution's founding in 1846, and that had arrived through 3 distinct channels: formal donation, field collection by the institution's own researchers, and what the internal administrative record called administrative transfer, material received from other federal agencies, federal field operatives, and government contractors without the documentation that accompanied formal donation or field collection. Administrative transfer material did not go through the institution's standard accession process. It was received, assigned an internal tracking number distinct from the public accession series, stored in the sublevel, and not entered into any catalog accessible to outside researchers. George Willis knew this because it was his job to manage the tracking numbers and the shelf locations. He had handled thousands of administrative transfer items over 34 years. He had documented their locations in an internal ledger system maintained separately from the institution's main inventory. He had never been told what most of them were. He had been told where to put them, how to maintain their storage environment, and to whom to report when a transfer item was requested for internal review. He had not been told, in 34 years, what the 7 categories contained. He had come to understand it on his own. The first category George Willis described to his son was skeletal material. Not the documented skeletal collections from the institution's formal anthropological research programs, Those were inventoried, accessioned, and in the standard storage system. The material in the first administrative transfer category occupied 37 linear feet of heavy-duty steel shelving on the sublevel's north wall, in individual acid-free boxes ranging from small to very large. Willis told his son that the very large boxes, the ones that required 2 men to move, contained bones that he had seen partially when boxes were opened for internal review, and that the bones he had seen were human in general morphology, but of dimensions inconsistent with normal human anatomy. He described femur lengths that his eye told him were significantly longer than any femur in the institution's formal osteological collections, which he also managed. He had moved the boxes in the first administrative transfer category 41 times over 34 years, as they were requested for review, returned, and repositioned on the shelving. He had never been in the room when a review was conducted. The reviews were conducted by staff he did not recognize and whose institutional identification he had never been able to confirm. The second category was metallurgical material. Objects in metal or metal-bearing composite whose composition had been noted in their internal tracking documentation as unclassified. Not unclassified in the sense of unknown, but unclassified in the sense of not matching any entry in the institution's materials reference catalog. Willis had handled approximately 230 individual items in this category over 34 years. He described them to his son as ranging from small, flat pieces, some with surface markings, to larger formed objects of a type he could not assign to any tool or implement category he recognized. Their weight, he said, was consistently wrong, heavier than their volume suggested, without exception. He had noted this in his internal logs and had been told by his supervisor, a man named Raymond Storch, who had held the collections management directorship from 1944 to 1962, that the weight discrepancy was a property of the alloy and was documented in the administrative transfer records. Willis had never seen those records. The third category was optical material. Glass objects, mirror fragments, and intact polished surfaces in various non-glass materials, whose tracking documentation described them as pre-contact, meaning manufactured before European contact with North America. Willis told his son that he had seen several of these objects removed from their storage packaging during internal reviews, and that the surfaces were unlike any glass or polished material he had encountered in the institution's formal collections. They were smooth in a way he found difficult to describe. Not the smoothness of modern polished glass, but a smoothness that seemed, in his words, to go into the surface rather than to sit on top of it. The tracking documentation for the optical category was the most sparse of any in the administrative transfer series. Some items had only a date of receipt, a weight, and a shelf location. No origin, no field notes, no donor record. The fourth category was textile material, woven fabrics and fiber-based objects in a storage configuration that maintained humidity at a level significantly lower than the rest of the sub-level storage, requiring Willis to monitor a dedicated environmental control system that had been installed for this category alone in 1952. He had never seen the textiles directly. The boxes in this category were sealed with a secondary closure system that required a key he did not have. He knew the boxes were there, and he knew the environmental requirements because he was responsible for maintaining the environment. But in 34 years, he had never been present when the Category 4 boxes were accessed. They were accessed 12 times in 34 years. He knew this because access required a notation in the internal log that he maintained. And each access was by the same 3 individuals, none of whom he recognized and only one of whom had ever spoken to him. That individual had told him, on the occasion of the last access Willis witnessed before his retirement in 1971, that the textile material in Category 4 was the oldest material in the institution's possession. Willis had asked how old. The individual said he was not able to answer that question. The fifth category Willis described as documentary material. Not paper documents, but objects that bore inscriptions, incised or applied markings on stone, metal, ceramic, and one material he could not identify that had the weight of stone and the surface texture of fired clay, but was neither. He had handled approximately 90 items in this category, all of them in individual padded cases with internal tracking numbers and no further description in the log beyond received and location. Willis told his son that he had seen the surface markings on several of the stone pieces when a case had been improperly sealed on delivery, and he had repackaged it himself. He described the markings as not resembling any writing system he had ever seen in the institution's public collections or in any publication he had looked at. He had looked after that repackaging incident. He had gone to the institution's library on his lunch breaks for 3 weeks and examined reproductions of ancient writing systems from the institution's published research programs. He had not found a match. The sixth category was what Willis called the biological material, not skeletal, not textile, but preserved soft tissue. The environmental requirements for this category were the most demanding in the sublevel. A dedicated refrigerated chamber maintained at a constant 4 degrees Celsius, with a humidity level and atmospheric composition that required weekly calibration of a monitoring system installed in 1948. Willis had maintained that system for 23 of his 34 years. He told his son that he had never seen the contents of the refrigerated chamber directly. He had seen the external packaging documentation on 3 occasions when deliveries arrived for the category, and the packaging described the contents only as biological specimen, administrative transfer, handle with extreme care. He told his son that the refrigerated chamber had received 8 deliveries in the 23 years he managed it, and that each delivery had arrived in a refrigerated transport unit operated by personnel in unmarked uniform with no institutional identification he could read. He had signed for each delivery because his job required him to sign. He had no knowledge of what he had signed for. The seventh category was what Willis called simply the large objects, items in the sublevel's largest storage bay, a room 40 feet long and 20 feet wide with a reinforced ceiling and a loading entrance separate from the rest of the sublevel, accessible only through an exterior door on the building's north face that did not appear on the institution's architectural plans as an entrance. Willis had managed the environmental monitoring for this bay for 34 years. He had entered it twice. The first time was in 1939, 2 years into his tenure, when a monitoring instrument had malfunctioned and his supervisor had unlocked the bay and sent him in to check the equipment. He had been in the room for approximately 4 minutes. He told his son that in those 4 minutes, he had seen 3 objects covered in heavy canvas sheeting that extended from the floor to a height he estimated at between 10 and 14 feet. He could not see the objects. He could see the shapes the canvas made, large, irregular, not identifiable as any object form he recognized. The second time he entered the large object bay was in 1968, when a water infiltration from the floor above required immediate assessment, and he had been sent in alone because he was the only sublevel staff member on duty that afternoon. He was in the room for 12 minutes. The canvas coverings were still there. There were now 4 of them. He told his son that in 1968, the 4th canvas covering was smaller than the others, and had been placed on a wooden pallet close to the loading entrance, and that the shape it made was one he did recognize. It had the outline of a figure in a seated or crouching position, with a head and shoulders distinguishable at the top. The figure, if it was a figure, was approximately 5 feet tall in that position. He did not touch the canvas. He assessed the water infiltration, made his notes, and left. He told no one what he had seen. He was 59 years old in 1968, and he had 23 years of institutional employment behind him, and he understood what that employment required. He told his son 3 years later, because he was 62 years old and he was leaving, and he had decided that not telling anyone was a form of participation he was no longer willing to maintain. The Smithsonian Institution's administrative transfer system, the mechanism by which material arrived in the sublevel without entering the public accession process, was established under the institution's original operational charter in the 1840s and has never been subject to external audit. The institution is a federal establishment, created by an act of Congress, funded by federal appropriation, but it operates under a hybrid legal status that exempts its internal collection management decisions from the Freedom of Information Act provisions that apply to executive branch agencies. The exemption has been challenged twice in federal court, in 1974 and in 1991, and upheld on both occasions on the grounds that the institution's charter grants it operational autonomy over its collections management that supersedes the general disclosure provisions of the Freedom of Information Act.
The 1974 challenge was filed by a researcher at George Washington University who had requested access to the institution's administrative transfer records after reading a reference to the system in a published history of the Bureau of American Ethnology. The court's ruling is on file. The researcher's underlying request for the administrative transfer records was never fulfilled. Raymond Storch, the collections management director who oversaw George Willis from 1944 to 1962, and who told Willis that the weight discrepancy in the metallurgical category was documented in administrative transfer records, Willis was never shown, retired in 1962, and died in 1978. His personal papers were donated to the American University Library in Washington in 1981 by his widow. They are in the library's special collections. The finding aid lists 3 boxes of correspondence and administrative records from his years at the Smithsonian. The boxes were processed and made available to researchers in 1984.
A note in the finding aid, added in 1991, states that Box 2, described in the original finding aid as containing institutional correspondence 1950 to 1962, was removed from the collection in January 1991 at the request of the Smithsonian Institution and transferred to the institution's own archives. The note gives no further explanation. The Smithsonian's own archives do not list Box 2 of the Storch papers in any accessible finding aid. It was removed from a public library in 1991 and placed in an institution whose collections management records are not subject to Freedom of Information Act disclosure. It has not been accessible to researchers since. The individual who told George Willis, on the occasion of the final Category 4 access Willis witnessed before his retirement, that the textile material was the oldest in the institution's possession, has never been identified. Willis gave his son a physical description. Male, approximately 50 years old, in a dark suit, without institutional identification, carrying a briefcase. He had appeared on the sublevel 4 times in Willis's tenure, always for Category 4 access. Always alone. Willis had logged each visit in the internal tracking record because his job required logging all access events. The internal tracking record was a physical ledger maintained in the sublevel's administrative office, a ledger Willis had filled himself in his own handwriting for 34 years. On the day of his retirement, Willis asked the incoming collections manager whether he wanted the old ledgers. The incoming manager said he would check with the directorate. Willis left the ledgers in the administrative office and went home. When David Willis called the institution 6 weeks later to ask what had become of his father's tracking ledgers, the registrar's office told him that no such ledgers were on file in any format and that the sub-level administrative office had been cleared and reorganized following the retirement transition. 34 years of handwritten location records for the administrative transfer collection. Gone in 6 weeks. David Willis is 84 years old. He lives in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the house he has owned since 1974. The shoebox containing the envelope with the 7 categories, written in his own hand on the back of an envelope that also carries a grocery list in his wife's handwriting, which places it in the kitchen of that house in September 1971, is on the top shelf of the closet in his home office. He showed it to one person outside his family, a researcher named Patricia Holt, who was writing a history of Smithsonian collections management practices for a private press in 2008. She interviewed David Willis for 3 hours in his living room. She copied the 7 categories from the envelope into her research notes. Her book was submitted to the press in 2010 and was not published. The press, a small academic imprint in Virginia, ceased operations in 2011. Patricia Holt is retired and living in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Her research notes are in 2 binders on a shelf in her home study. The envelope is in Silver Spring. The notes are in Fredericksburg. The sublevel of the Museum of Natural History is open to qualified researchers by written application to the institution's Collections Access Office. The application form requires institutional affiliation and a description of the research purpose. The processing time is 60 to 90 days. No application requesting access to the administrative transfer holdings has ever been received by the collection's access office, because no application can request access to holdings whose existence is not disclosed in any public-facing catalog. George Willis, 62 years old, September 14th, 1971. His last night before 34 years ended. He sat with his son at the kitchen table and named the 7 categories one by one in the order he had first encountered each of them, beginning with the skeletal material on the north wall and ending with the large objects under canvas in the bay with the door that was not on the architectural plans. He had spent 34 years knowing where everything was. He told his son because someone should know, and his son was the person whose knowing he could trust. The 7 categories are still there. The sub-level storage has not been decommissioned. The environmental systems George Willis maintained for 34 years, the dedicated refrigeration for the biological material, the humidity control for the textiles, the reinforced bay for the large objects, are still in operation. They require maintenance. Someone is maintaining them. The objects they protect are still on the shelves, in the acid-free boxes, under the canvas covers, in the refrigerated chamber, in the room with the door that does not appear on the building's floor plans. The building is open to the public 6 days a week. The exhibition halls are free of charge. The sublevel is 1 floor below the entrance. What is sealed at 200 feet underground in a county that has been fenced since 1974 is one part of this record. What is sitting in a climate-controlled room beneath a public building in Washington, D.C. is another part. The difference is that one of them has visiting hours.